Welcome to F5 Performance Management. F5 is a relatively low-level ACCA paper at the beginning of the skills level. This means that some of you may have already studied the ACCA fundamentals levels, F1, F2 and F3. Please bear in mind, if you have not studied these, for example, because you have exemption, there is no problem. Anything that you need to know about F5 is included in the lectures that we record. Now, let's consider what F5 is all about. Firstly, it's a management accounting paper. Some of you may know what management accounting is already. But what we have to bear in mind is this. F5 is called performance management. And that means that your examiner is required to emphasize the performance management aspects of management accounting. What this means is that when we look at the topics, as we will do in a moment, we are going to consider each area of management accounting, at least at a general level, but we're going to link each area to performance measurement in some way. That has been the emphasis of the exam from the beginning, and if you remember that, you will be successful in the exam. Too many people focus on management accounting for the sake of management accounting, and maybe that's where they upset the examiner and throw away some easy marks. Secondly, it builds on knowledge from F2 management accounting. Okay, if you've done F2, that's great. That will give you some background and maybe it will help you a little bit from a conceptual perspective. But you have to remember that although, yes, it does build on F2, there is very little crossover in terms of what you learned at F2 and what you're learning here. Possibly 2, maybe 3 subjects out of the whole paper draw heavily on what you've done before. Instead, what we do is we take F2 as read, we know that already, and we're going to do something more. So, if you haven't done F2, and I'll reiterate this again, please do not worry. What we're obviously going to do is focus on those things that you need to know to pass the exam. The other thing that I must highlight at this point is about F5 and the thing that really concerns a lot of students. And that is that it is a mix of both computational and interpretational skills. Yes, you have to be able to run the numbers, there's no problem with that. But something like half of the marks are for interpreting either what you've already done or information that's been given to you by the examiner. It's those interpretational marks that a lot of people have difficulty with. You shouldn't have. You just have to be aware that that is what the paper is all about. Now, let's look at the syllabus and see what is what. If we look at the basic syllabus areas, there are 5. Firstly, we have costing methods. Now, costing methods is very much taking what you should maybe already know from your F2 or previous studies. Don't worry, we backfill all that knowledge. And just augmenting it, looking at how things may develop or change. Then we have something called decision making, possibly the single most important topic area, at least from the perspective of variety of types of things that the examiner may examine. Then we have budgeting, a relatively small topic, but of course it includes things like forecasting. Then a big one, we have variances. Now in simple terms, you may have learnt variances before, but what we're going to do is we're going to take what you've learnt and develop and develop and develop it. There's quite a lot there. And then finally, we have performance measurement. And as I've said already, although performance measurement is a standalone topic, you have to remember that there are links between performance measurement and all of the others. So, you would expect some element of performance measurement to be in at least, well, I would say, 3 or 4 of the questions that you get. To look very briefly at more detail, let's just consider the sort of things that may arise. Looking at costing methods, the big topic area is something you may have come across before, something called activity-based costing, or ABC. you would expect that to arise quite frequently. Then you have a number of other relatively simple topics: target costing, life cycle costing, throughput accounting and backflush accounting. These will all come up, but they're not a big issue. If we were to look at decision making, as I've already said, there are a number of bits and pieces we have to be ready for. We have to know about linear programming at a much higher level than you may have studied before at F2. We also have to know about relevant cost analysis in terms of short-term decision making. We also have to look at pricing. Now, you could argue that pricing doesn't necessarily have to be part of decision making, but it's put here in this syllabus for various reasons. And then finally, we have uncertainty. We're looking at the idea that possibly things are not certain, and we have to look at the range of possible outcomes and their relative likelihood. So, decision making, a big topic area in terms of both learning and in terms of examination. Then we move on to budgeting. Budgeting, I think, is the simplest of all of the topic areas. You've got to know what budgeting is, not difficult. You've got to know your budgeting types, nice, easy marks in the exam. But of course, we do have one interesting area here that we're now going to see again and again, and that's behavioural aspects. You know, the idea that if we set a budget in one way, it may lead people to do the right thing or the wrong thing. Behavioural aspects comes up in a whole range of different areas within this paper, and this is the first area that we see it. And then, the only numbers you really have in budgeting relate to forecasting. And there are quite a lot of fun numbers there. So long as you're not afraid of the numbers, a nice, easy mark scoring area. Then we look at variances. Well, if we were to consider variances, we've got standard costing first of all, and then we have the basic variances that arise from standard costing. Now, for a lot of you, that will be stuff that you already know. Great. You have to know this stuff. If you go into the exam not knowing your variances, you're throwing away marks just because you haven't bothered to do enough work. But once we've got those basics, then we develop, as I said before, into something a little bit more complicated. And again, your examiner wants to talk about behavioural aspects. In simple terms, if you are a manager who is responsible for a specific set of variances, it's very likely that how the variances arise are going to impact on what decisions that you make, good or bad for the company. And then finally, we have performance measurement. Now, this is a mixed bag. We have divisional performance appraisal, which is not a problem at all. We also have non-financial performance. The idea that maybe we should better measure how people are doing by not just looking at profitability, say, but other measures of what they are trying to achieve. In addition, we have not-for-profit organisations and the public sector and how we assess performance there. And again, we have behavioural implications relating to all of this. So, those are the 5 areas of the syllabus. If we were to look at the exam format was changed a number of sittings ago to try and make it as easy as possible for you. First thing we have to remember is that it's compulsory. There's no choice here. So, that means you have to learn a little bit of everything. Otherwise, you're going to get caught out. You have 5 questions of 20 marks each. And I don't think it requires a rocket scientist to appreciate that we would expect 1 question in each of the core syllabus areas. If we plan for that, we're going to be sorted. Finally, how do we pass F5? I'm sure that's what you wish to know more than anything else. Well, first of all, you've got to know the numbers. So master the computations. So make sure that you practice. You don't just see me doing stuff, but you practice the questions yourself. It's very much a doing subject. Secondly, understand the theory behind what we're trying to do. Now, there's not much theory here, but it does make it so much easier to do those discursive or interpretational parts of the question if you can grasp the basic idea. Thirdly, be able to interpret the requirements and the narrative in the exam. One of the issues about this paper is that you can walk in off the street and interpret what the examiner has said and score some easy marks. In simple terms, if you comment on what the examiner has talked about, you are going to be doing the right thing. So, one fundamental area is to make sure that you can interpret both the requirement and the narrative. And finally, of course, you have to practice exam questions. Practice exam questions in an exam environment, limited to time. That way, you know that you will be able to do it before you go into the exam. Well, that's it. That's what F5's about. Get studying and do something.